the mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank, and like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, medical, or mental health advice. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the podcast and are not intended to malign any religion, group, club, organization, business, individual, anyone, or anything. I'm Sarah Edmondson.
And I'm Anthony, air quotes nippy, Ames.
And this is A Little Bit Culty, a podcast about what happens when things that seem like a great thing at first go bad.
Every week, we chat with survivors, experts, and whistleblowers for real cult stories told directly by the people who lived through them.
Because we want you to learn a few things we've had to learn the hard way.
Like, if you think you're too smart to get sucked into something culty, you're already prime recruitment material.
You might even already be in a cult.
Oops. You better keep listening to find out.
Welcome to Season 6 of A Little Bit Culty. Hey, A Little Bit Culty listeners. We made you another bonus mixtape of some of our fave segments with none other than Dan Shaw, Dr. Ramani, and Dr. Natalie Feinblatt, a sort of chicken soup for the Culty Soul medley.
We've got Dan Shaw dropping knowledge on why traumatizing narcissists are so, well, traumatizing.
We've got Dr. Ramani on how to recover from narcissistic abuse. And we've got Dr. Natalie Feinblatt on trauma, addiction, and cult-informed therapy. It's a super group.
We're going to start with the sweet, soulful, and mega helpful Dan Shaw, who was one of the first people we connected with on our road out of NXIVM. He's a licensed clinical social worker and a psychoanalyst in private practices in New York City and in Nyack, New York. And he's the author of several important resources on narcissism and cult recovery.
You can hear the full episode with Dan Shaw in our first season. The link's in our show notes. And in that full episode, you can hear more about his story as a survivor from his own culty nightmare.
But don't go anywhere just yet. Let's get you started with this segment and be sure to stick around because we'll hear from Dr. Ramani and Dr. Feinblatt.
So put your feet up, put your listening ears on. This is going to be good, kids.
Here's Dan Shaw, and you're listening to A Little Bit Culty, a therapy sesh remix.
Would you mind just defining that term, gaslighting, for anyone who doesn't know?
Well, it comes from this great movie. I won't become film nerd right now, but it's called Gaslight. And it's the story of a woman with a lot of money who marries a guy who slowly drives her insane so that he can steal her money. And every time she tries to point out the things that he's doing, he totally denies it. And he just says, "Oh, my dear, you poor thing, you must rest." So he drives her more and more crazy. And it's a fabulous movie. Everybody should see it. It's a Hollywood classic. But, what we mean now by gaslighting is not necessarily that somebody deliberately wants to drive you crazy in order to exploit you. But gurus do need to drive followers insane in order to exploit them. They need to make followers feel dependent, ashamed, needy, scared. Every cult leader does this to every follower. You might get elevated for a while, but then you're going to fall. So you're always being made to feel that everything is your fault. You know what gaslighting is? You heard the clip of Raniere telling Allison how to set up DOS? Mm-hmm. That was pure gaslighting.
Just to add to it, my understanding is also that this man turned the oil down on the gaslight so it was too dark to read, and he pretended that he could read, and she was like, "It's too dark for me to read," and he's like, "What are you talking about? It's totally fine."
Exactly.
So she thought she was crazy. Yeah, we should watch that movie, Nippy.
I've seen it.
Oh, well, he's ahead of the game, isn't he?
Charles Boyer and Ingrid Bergman, directed by George Cukor. Must see.
And since we're on the definition section of our program, could you also define narcissist or narcissism?
Well, I'm defining traumatic narcissism as somewhat different from the psychology version of pathological narcissism.
Okay.
Pathological narcissism is something you talk about as like this person is a pathological narcissist. And it's like inside of them, they have these problems. But my whole takeaway from being in the cult and observing the guru, and then others in my personal life and others my patients, once I became a clinician, started telling me about, my feeling was that narcissism is a relational system. There has to be a predator narcissist, and there has to be his mark, his target, right? So I'm going to tell you what I think a traumatizing narcissist is. I think that's a person who has a need to be perfect and always right, never wrong, and has to get somebody else to submit to him or her and believe the same thing. He has to believe delusionally that he's perfect and right, because otherwise he would die of shame. He's grown up in some way being humiliated, being shamed. Shame is unbearable for a narcissist. So the traumatizing narcissist figures out how to have no shame by having a delusion of omnipotence, of being perfect, blameless, shameless, flawless, and has to have a follower who's going to hold all of that blame and shame and neediness and vulnerability for him. He's going to deny it in himself, and he's going to make others be the ones to hold it. So I think you can recognize this in the way Keith behaved.
100%. Now, in retrospect.
Yeah. And so the traumatizing narcissists are people who, like, they're very grandiose even though they're insecure, or they're very insecure even though they're actually more grandiose, and they sort of flip from one side to the other. But a traumatizing narcissist doesn't flip. He maintains dominance by his delusion of omnipotence, and he needs then followers or significant others who submit and who are subjugated, who are under his control, and who hold all of that shame and dependency that he disavows.
It's kind of the ultimate parasite, ironically.
Yes, it's also Dracula, and it's also zombies. It's like you're dead and you have to eat live people's blood to be, to keep your status, right?
Wow. And here he was teaching us that it was so terrible to be dependent.
He's the most dependent of them all. The most dependent. Did everybody look at V Week? What the fuck is V Week? But I need.
So when we were in it, if anyone were to say that to me, I'm just putting myself back in like the headspace of 10 years ago, I would have thought, he doesn't need that. That's his followers just paying him tribute.
Exactly.
So, because he was very strategic, I think, in making it look like none of it was his idea.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
I don't need this, guys. I mean, if you want to have 10-day birthday celebration as a present, and that's, I'm not your guru. Like, he did this whole faux humble thing, right, Nip? Like,
yeah, it was also for me. V Week was to me kind of a corporate retreat more than.
Yeah.
Celebrating his birthday.
But we did celebrate his birthday. Like every center put on presentations for him, remember, which we hated.
I was never in.
It was like the gift of the Magi. You all had to come bearing frankincense and myrrh and lay it at his feet.
Yes. And our presentations were never good enough, Dan. Do you know how many times I got in trouble for having subpar presentations?
Of course.
Like we made films, we did dances, we did group choreography with like 60 people. It was never good enough.
Look, he didn't want to have V Week. That was everybody else's idea. The same way he didn't want to have DOS. That was everybody else's idea. Same bullshit.
Right.
Since we're on a little comparison here, I was just curious, since most of our listeners have been following the NXIVM story. So in working with me as my counselor during this time, I mean, I remember so many good nuggets that I got from working with you, but I was just curious what you saw without breaking client confidentiality with other people. But I felt like as you talked to more of us, you started to see certain patterns in relation to your own experience. And I was wondering if you could share some of those things that you saw as a consistency in the type of abuse that we endured at all different levels. Like I've said in many other interviews, like what I experienced was very different than people who lived there or who were with Keith in a closer capacity or even sexually. What did you see as a consistent pattern?
Well, if you saw Robert De Niro portray Bernie Madoff just died in jail. It's an excellent film. The actual reporter who interviewed Madoff extensively was in that movie. And the last scene is her talking to him in jail. And she says something about him being a psychopath. And De Niro's last line is something like, wait a minute, you don't really think I'm a psychopath, do you? And that's the end of that movie. Well, these people are malignant narcissists is the way that I would put it. And malignant narcissist is the term Erich Fromm came up with when he studied Hitler and he studied other dictators and people like this. They're like the traumatizing narcissists, but they go big. They go national. And what's really motivating them more than anything else, they're never going to acknowledge any shame whatsoever about anything. They have to believe there's nothing they can do or say to anyone that can ever cause them to feel ashamed. And then people go wild for that. Wow. You mean we could just be ourselves and not be ashamed and just say what we want, be angry the way we want to be and, just be rude and cruel and mean because that's righteous. It's like cruelty becomes righteousness. Shame in a normal human being, which, by the way, is in every human being. It's there for a reason. We have to learn. We have to develop a moral compass about what's right and wrong. And without shame, we don't really learn that. Shame becomes an incentive. In order not to feel ashamed, we're incentivized to do good. But these guys, in order not to feel ashamed,
right,
are incentivized to be delusional and megalomaniacal.
We tell our stories. We change the world. A Little Bit Culty is proud to support the #IGotOut project, which empowers survivors of cultic abuse to share their stories online as a catalyst for education, prevention, and healing. Learn more about the #IGotOut movement and find resources at igotout.org.
Quick follow-up to the role of shame and how it relates particularly to narcissistic leaders. Sarah and I are watching Yellowstone, and there's a scene in it where the sister is talking to the brother about the best politicians are good politicians are narcissists. The best ones are psychopaths.
Yeah, one of those.
Right?
One of the.
And I immediately accessed this book I read about Stalin probably about 10, 11 years ago. I think it was called Stalin's Follies. And the body count on Stalin is still being tallied by the Russians. They don't really know. And the reason Hitler's so well documented is because it's all on film and it was documented. There was a poll in Russia, I remember reading like in 1990, 1991, and 51 to 52% of the population considered Stalin a national hero. It was mind-boggling to me when I read that. And this pertains to the shame of that thing, is they don't seem to ever feel the shame, or there seems to be a lack of acknowledgement of it. And I wanted you to comment on that, because I just think it's and I wonder, like, if someone who's sitting in a jail cell right now feels that, acknowledges it, or how does that work? What's the mechanism? And I asked a similar question in our last one, and the response was good, because we don't really know, because we don't have a lot of psychoanalysis on these people. But your best shot. What do you think?
I think there are some people who may in fact have a genetic disposition towards sociopathy or psychopathy, or, that's probably true. But I think for a lot of people, they have to experience growing up intense chronic humiliation. Robert J. Lifton studied Shoko Asahara, the guru in Japan that had his very highly educated academics and scientists released nerve gas in the subway because they were going to purify the world to save it. When Shinrikyo grew up, he was bullied and teased by his peers. He had a terrible vision problem, and he felt ashamed of it. He later went bankrupt selling fake Chinese herbs. And ultimately, he becomes this guru. I mean, look at Hitler, this totally nebbishy, incapable of succeeding guy. These people find a way to completely banish shame from their psyche. But it's denial, it's disavowal, it's dissociative. It's not normal.
So if I try to see this, someone without shame looks free to someone who does have shame. And if you don't see shame as a necessary requisite for you to have empathy, morality, you're going to see that person as free, and you're going to potentially see yourself as limited by your shame when it's actually an asset.
That is so well put. That's right on.
Okay.
That's it. You
nailed it.
All right.
I don't know if we've talked about this anywhere else, but this just reminded me of something that Keith actually talked about in forums a number of times. You've probably heard this already, Dan, that he taught us this psychological makeup of a sociopath. He called it a suppressive, right? Somebody who doesn't have morality because they see the world as a range of options, and they'll do things that people with morality would never do, like lie, steal, and cheat, so that they have more options than a normal person. Therefore, they appear to be even more, what's the word? Confident. Yeah, more confident and free, because they will do all these things that we would never consider because we have morality.
Right.
And he said this example. Do you remember this about the robots?
Yeah.
Yeah, so check this out. And we thought he was just teaching us about what to look out for in the world. We didn't realize he was teaching us about him.
They would masquerade as thought exercises.
Yes, he would do thought exercises with us a lot. And the exercise was, imagine being in prison.
Yeah.
And you're in prison, and to get out of the prison,
which he doesn't have to imagine anymore.
Right. Ironically, to get out of the prison, you're going to have to kill the kill the bodyguards. And imagine that as a person, that's really like, to be free, you're going to have to kill a human. And that's hard, right? So imagine now that you're in prison and the bodyguards are actually robots. Would you feel better about dismantling a robot to be free? And then people go, yeah, of course. I could just, dismantle the robot. He's like, well, that's what it's like for a sociopath. Humans are just robots in the way. You don't see them as humans that you'd have to hurt. It's just robots to get out of the way to achieve your goals.
Wow.
So that's him.
It's blood-curdling to hear.
But I know, I just got shivers. And the joy that he probably got sitting up there on his stupid fucking throne. I say throne with, it was a chair, but it was elevated. And him telling us these stories, and we're all like, oh yes, thank you, Vanguard, for educating us on the nature of sociopathy. While he's like, yeah, that's what I'm doing to you right now, you suckers.
Yeah, I mean, among the most sadistic things he did was have people watch those films of beheadings. He was just unbelievably sadistic and cruel. And it was very largely aimed at women. In the name of creating a band of alpha men, I mean, he was creating, army of betas for himself, to go try to make him prosper and spread the word, spread the gospel. It's so fortunate. You guys stopped him, you and the others, we know who they are, and they are extraordinary, all of you. But I was worried like hell for you, Sarah and Nippy, and for all the others, Mark and Bonnie and everybody, because nobody ever got out of a cult and did what you did. Everybody who got out of a cult is more like me. Spend a year trying to pretend like it didn't happen before you start to realize, what the fuck happened to me? You guys went like, boom.
Well, it's interesting, Dan. That's why I asked you the disenfranchised question. For me, I had been disenfranchised for a while. I felt like the reason I was there, and I think in Janja Jelich's book, it's called Moral Injury, the mission, it wasn't happening. We were throwing rocks at Tank, and it just felt it wasn't happening, and I didn't see it happening.
Yeah.
But I also felt like the hooks were in me. It was like, okay, it's going to be hard to do what we're doing. It's not going to be easy, and it takes a certain amount of effort for you to achieve any goal. No matter what you're going to do, no matter what I was going to do in my life, it was going to be difficult. And I understood that in trying to be successful in anything. But then I just kind of felt like there were so many things I was disenfranchised with. So the pivot when the actual violent thing was obvious to me was easy.
Yeah.
And while, I do appreciate you saying, we did the right thing, we were dragged into this. I'm not saying I would have walked away from my wife being branded. That just wasn't going to happen. I just didn't know my recourse just yet.
Yeah.
But because Claire Bronfman got on a plane and tried to get my wife arrested, we were forced to go do certain things.
Mm-hmm.
So the narrative that we destroyed this community and that was our objective, it wasn't until we were dragged into a fight. And then when you go into a fight, you can't hit half-heartedly.
No.
You can't go in and slap. You got to go in and you got to throw your punch as hard as you can. And for whatever reason, we had a lot of things line up for us where powers to be in the universe and Mercury was in retrograde, whatever you want to say, it lined up where our punches landed, and it turned out it was a paper tiger because, it was a house of cards that we ended up punching. So we threw hard punches, but we didn't know we were exposing. So yes, I appreciate you saying those things, but we were dragged into it. We were scared.
But we also chose to fight.
I've said this to Sarah many times. There was no way he was going to get away with doing that to my wife.
When you spend any time in a cult at all, day in, day out, hour after hour, day after day, all you're fucking doing is submitting. Mm-hmm. And if you get out and you don't find a part of you that can fight, whether it's to bring your cult down or not, because most people don't succeed when they try to do that, you're a rare exception and a good and a great model. But even if you don't fight to bring your cult down, you got to be fighting to take back your life.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have a fight in you about that, you're just going to go find another cult. You got to fight to take back your life when you leave a cult.
But that does take a lot of work. And I remember you asking me that in one of my first sessions. You were like, do you want to maybe heal first before you become an activist?
Yeah.
And I was like, I think I got to become an activist. Like, I mean, by activist, I mean, I'm actively taking it down and bringing people out and trying to educate people as to what's really happened and everything.
It was either crush or be crushed. So you had to fight.
So what challenges do people have leaving a narcissist leader in spite of all the evidence that may be pointing to the fact that they're a narcissist leader and they're being abused?
Like what keeps them in, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, both questions are, they're two sides of the same question. What keeps you in and what's hard when you leave? You develop an attachment bond to the narcissist. You're seduced. You see a part of them that looks like it has the most love anybody ever had, and they're going to give it to you, especially if you're in a vulnerable place in your life, as many people are when they get involved in these things. Most people, I would say, are in some kind of vulnerable place in their life, as I was at the end of my 20s. So you see somebody who looks like they have the most love of any human being you've ever met, and they're going to give it to you. You form some kind of a bond that's like the bond of an infant to a parent, to a mother. This person has the love that I need in order for me to become who I want to be, is how it feels. Once you've started on that path, as we all know about the frog in the water that slowly heats up to a boil, if they start being cruel and abusive, you tell yourself that it's part of the love, and you keep expanding the definition of what their love is until their love means that they want you to get branded, or their love means that they want you to go after one of their enemies and throw acid in their face. I mean, people in cults are violated. What a cult leader does is they teach us to let them violate our boundaries, and then they teach us to violate other people's boundaries on their behalf.
Right. So how does defending or expanding their definition of love lend to them expanding their own delusion?
Right. Well, the more people are submitting to them, the more it's clear to them that, I really am God. I was saying I thought I was, but look, here's these 1,000 people. Every woman is willing to have sex with me, and every man would let me beat him up if I wanted to. Great, I must be God. That's the way Rajneesh was,
Right, with his Rolls Royces.
Yeah, right. And I'm trying to get to why it's so hard to leave. But when you do leave, it's usually because you've been tortured to a point where you finally can't take anymore. Then what's hard, this shameless asshole cult leader is still shameless, but now you are totally ashamed of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Now you've left, and now you have to face a world where everybody says, what the fuck is wrong with you? Why did you stay? And why didn't you leave? And that. And, everybody is looking at you like you're a three-headed freak because you are so stupid that you were in that cult. So you now are stuck with all the shame that this asshole refuses to experience. And that's what happened for me. I said, you know what? That's bullshit. I had to fight because I was 42 and I was penniless and I wanted to have a life. And so I fought like hell to get the money from people to help me get my degree and get my training and to start a family. And I just fought and fought and fought. After a while, I can honestly say that I don't have to fight so hard anymore. It took a long time though.
This podcast wouldn't happen without our amazing, supportive, generous patrons. Are you with us? Come find us over on Patreon at patreon.com/alittlebitculty for bonus episodes, exclusive content, and the occasional Zoom with our fan favorites from our past episodes. It's a lot of fun over there, people.
The Frankies were a picture-perfect influencer family, but everything wasn't as it seemed.
I just had a 12-year-old boy show up here asking for help. He's emaciated. He's got tape around his legs. Ruby Frankie is his mom's name.
Infamous is covering Ruby Frankie, the world of Mormonism, and a secret therapy group that ruined lives. Listen to Infamous wherever you get your podcasts.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
Okay, so you were just listening to a segment from our episode with Dan Shaw, an expert on cult recovery and cult-informed therapy. Be sure to check out that whole episode if you want to learn more about his story, and shout out to you, Dan, if you hear this, because we love you.
But next up, we're going to get into the weeds with Dr. Ramani, who is a licensed clinical psychologist and the author of 2 books on the subject, Should I Stay or Should I Go? Surviving a Relationship with a Narcissist, and Don't You Know Who I Am? How to Stay Sane in an Era of Narcissism, Entitlement, and Incivility. She's got a kick-ass podcast, too, called Navigating Narcissism with Dr. Ramani. Listen to our full conversation with her if you like. That link's in the show notes.
Definitely one of our favorite episodes of all time, and in this clip, we jump right into it. Are narcissists born that way? What even are they? Is there such a thing as a narc repellent lotion? Just kidding, we didn't ask that. Keep listening. Here's a snippet of our chat with the great and greatly helpful Dr. Ramani. Thanks for listening to this A Little Bit Culty Therapy Sesh remix. We needed this. So we realized that you've done so many interviews and you have a huge body of incredibly helpful work out there, which we're going to be giving to our listeners as homework. They do like the homework. But since our podcast is a little bit culty, we're going to try to take your expertise and apply it more to this field that the podcast covers. Before we do that, we wondered if we could just start with like a baseline so that our listeners understand this word, narcissism, in context to the cult space and how maybe sort of breaking down like how that word is a bit overused, misunderstood, giving us a little bit of like foundation.
It's been thrown out a lot in the last 5 to 6 years for reasons I think we all can speculate.
Right. It really is. It is a very overused, very misunderstood, but also really important word. I think that in the anger that people have of it being overused and misunderstood, people are forgetting the potency of the word. And it is a word that gives us a lot of information if you're getting the right information. So narcissism is a personality style, right? It's not a disorder. It's a personality style. And it is characterized by certain consistent patterns in a person, such as having really inconsistent empathy. And I'm going to talk about this idea of it being inconsistent empathy. Usually we just say it's a lack of empathy. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. So inconsistent empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, validation and admiration seeking, arrogance, a need for control, a real hypersensitivity to any kind of feedback or criticism, envy of others, or they assume that other people envy them, a real incapacity for deep relationships or true intimacy, and a very externalized model of going through the world. So in essence, they set their goals on the basis of what they think the world wants them to do. Their identity is very much shaped by how the world views them instead of having a strong internal sense of self. But at the bottom line, people with narcissistic personalities are actually deeply insecure and have deep-seated feelings of inadequacy. So all of those things I'm talking about, the grandiosity, the arrogance, the entitlement, it's almost like a suit of armor that protects this really vulnerable internal piece of them that they are not even in touch with. But if anyone criticizes them, it's almost like that wound comes up and they lash out. And the reason I say inconsistent empathy is that some people will say, I met someone, but times they seem really empathic. Empathy for a narcissistic person is very transactional and it can be very performative. They use it to get what they need. So if you and the narcissist have really aligned needs, wants, or desires at the same time, you might actually feel like this is the most empathic person I've ever met. What will happen is that once that need has been served or they no longer are aligned with you, they will seem like the most cold, aloof, rejecting, or even contemptuous person. That confusion is often what keeps people in the game. So what happens is they're saying, I want to go back to empathic day. And so they bring it upon themselves. Like, how can I please them? How can I win them over? How can I get them over back to that beautiful empathy they seem to have? What they don't understand is that narcissistic people know that empathy is a thing. They also know how to use it, but it's not genuine empathy. Again, it's very performative.
So all those things, insecure, arrogance, all those things, and I'll speak for me, but I imagine a lot of people have felt like that in their lives, right? What would you say? It doesn't mean just because you're arrogant, you're entitled, it's a thing, and you can outgrow those things. When does it become a narcissistic thing and not just a growing pain, so to speak?
Right. So that takes us almost to like, how does personality develop, right? Personality is part of how the central nervous system develops. And the central nervous system is sort of not really done. And I almost view it as a Jell-O mold. I'm like, if you open the Jell-O mold too quick, it's just going to splat on the table. You really have to wait until a person's around somewhere between 25 and 30 to say this brain is cooked, and almost a little older for men than women. But then you can pop the Jell-O mold and you got the shape. So that's how personality works. And that's why adolescence is so tricky. Some people will say every adolescent is narcissistic. And I'm like, yeah, kind of, because that's the nature of that stage of development. Adolescents are trying to separate. They're trying to become their own people. In many ways, they're almost trying to say, all you folks who are trying to control me, namely parents, get away from me. I'm going to do my own thing. And so I always liken to them to having clothes that are just too big for them and they're trying to fit into them. So there's lots of emotion, lots of raging, lots of figuring it out. That's adolescence. So I've told many parents, I'll say, listen, narcissism is a story that can only be told backwards, but not forward. So if you have a 17-year-old, 18, 19-year-old kid who is acting like an entitled, arrogant, oppositional, unempathic jerk to you, I'm sorry. And I really am. And then call me in 7 years and let's see where you're at. Because in many cases, that kid is going to grow up to the demands of the world. They're going to have to learn how to behave in a workplace. Empathy is going to kick in. And now that they feel more sort of in their own skin, the parents will start seeing that empathy come back, all of that. Now, the problem is for the parents who say, okay, my 30-year-old is still the same entitled, unempathic, arrogant jerk that they were in their teens. And that's when I say you might have a problem, because now it seems that they didn't. So in other words, you can tell the story backwards. They were like that then, they're like that now. But so many people at 17 will grow out of it. So there's definitely that piece of it. Then some people say, like, what about the showboater? Like the person who's got the big ideas and they come in and they hold the stage, but then off stage, I'll ask them, what's their behavior like? This is a person who might really be able to hold the room, but then when you talk to them on their own and they're very sweet, they're very kind, they're very solicitous and self-aware and self-reflective, like they're not narcissistic. They're able to put a grandiose show on a stage, but they're also very aware of other people, not a narcissist. But that person who's up there on that stage prancing about as an arrogant, grandiose performer and is a jerk off stage, narcissist.
Okay.
It's the consistency, it's the stability, it's the pervasiveness that it cuts across multiple relationships. We're looking for like a pattern,
Right.
not for somebody who behaves badly on one afternoon that they got fired.
Right.
This is not a one-off. This is a life-off. It's happening all the time.
Got it.
Well, just looking at the patterns of narcissism within the cult world and what we're seeing right now with series like The Tinder Swindler or Inventing Anna, where does it cross over from narcissism to narcissistic sociopath? And what are the tendencies to look out for? How do you distinguish those things?
So when we start using terms like, so for example, you're bringing up two examples, Tinder Swindler, Inventing Anna, of people who were, in essence, grifters. They were probably more in the sociopathic, maybe even marginally psychopathic, but more sociopathic realm. When we start bringing in other terminology like sociopathy and psychopathy, we have to view narcissism as being on a continuum, on a spectrum, right? So at the low end of narcissism, where it's light, narcissism light, as it were, you're talking about people who are sort of superficial, adolescent, emotionally stunted. At the age of 50, they still seem to concern themselves with the things like, hey, we're going to a cake party. I'm like, oh my God, you're 55. Like, what is happening, right? They're annoying. They're ridiculous. There's no depth to the relationship, but they're not psychologically harmful. At the far end of the spectrum, though, now you're leaning into malignant narcissism. And malignant narcissism is really where we see not only all the top notes of narcissism, but some of the stuff we see in psychopathy, the hostility, the callousness, the exploitativeness, the willingness to take advantage of people. And we also see some sadism mixed into there.
Yes.
We see some paranoia, and we see Machiavellianism. So now it starts getting scary. Then the train goes into the more scary stations like sociopathy and psychopathy. Psychopathy is the most terrifying of all because now we're no longer talking about insecurity. These are people whose nervous systems are very, very different. They do not get that sympathetic nervous system activation that we all get when we do something wrong. Like we feel uncomfortable. If we do a bad thing, we're like, oh, this does not feel good. We'll feel sick. We can't sleep. Psychopath can do, I don't know, can rob a bank at breakfast and be having lunch with their mom and not even think about that sequence. Like they're not bothered by doing bad things. Narcissists are bothered by doing bad things. They don't want to get caught. They don't want to get publicly found out. They actually do value how the world sees them. The psychopath, it's a little less important to them. Sociopaths are a different animal. Sociopathic people are people who they're much more dysregulated than the psychopaths. So they're like the narcissists. They get angry very easily. They're your bar brawlers. They get really upset. They can be very manipulative. They'll take advantage of people, but they're not the cool operators like the psychopathic folks. Sociopathy is actually not a term we use in the mental health world. It's more of almost like sociological, criminological kind of a term. And so it's not as well defined in our world, but that malignant narcissism. And if you look at Fromm's work, Fromm has actually written about cult leaders. And he specifically said, cult leaders are malignant narcissists. And I agree with that. I think 100% of cult leaders are malignant narcissists, without exception. I've never seen one story of one. By definition, a cult is a controlling space that is exploitative. That's the malignant narcissist space.
So you have these terms for these people and, with empathy, and I'm curious where the empathy and conscience comes in, because a lot of them are very high performers in certain domains. And I think in some of your talks, you mentioned how they get a hall pass because of that. I'll use examples like Steve Jobs. I know he could be very temperamental, to a Michael Jordan who is win at all costs. And they seem to have a capacity to, and I certainly wouldn't necessarily throw them in those categories, but they seem to have a capacity. Even when I was playing sports, I could put my empathy on the back burner to perform, right? But when the game was over, there's a way you compete and there's a civility to society that we all re-enter. And maybe some of them do, some of them don't. I'm curious as to when, how do you make those distinctions and what kind of freedom do they have without their empathy that seems to serve humanity sometimes? Like, if these people are contributing to humanity, like how do you reconcile those differences? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
It absolutely makes sense. Empathy makes us very inefficient. That's a bottom line. It is like the drag coefficient on our souls.
It's a paralysis sometimes because you have to work it out.
I wouldn't even say it's a paralysis as much as if I'm going about my day and I see someone, a colleague of mine, is sad or upset, and I'm like, hey, let's go get a cup of coffee. Let's talk it out. And they're starting to tell me about, they're having marital problems, and I'm there for them and I'm helping them. I might have just lost an hour of my workday, and now I got to stay an hour later. I'm inefficient. Or if I say, oh, maybe I should let that person get the promotion. They've been here longer. They're just as good at me as the position. Now I haven't thrown them under the bus because I had the inside track and could have gotten it, but I recognize they're older, they're more experienced. In fact, their family could use the money. I just lost efficiency. The more empathy you have, the less efficient you are in the most beautiful way, by the way. You know what I'm saying? But in a winner take all, capitalistic, whoever has the most toys wins society, that the people who don't have empathy and are willing to climb over whoever they need to climb to are going to be your billionaires, your innovators. They're not stopping to change a baby's diaper, right? They are all in on their success. And you're absolutely right. Then we look at them. They're the visionaries. They've changed the world. I get all of that. And I'll even tip my hat and say what you did change the world. What I say to the world is, don't marry these people. Don't get close to these people.
They're not father of the year.
They're not father of the year. They're not person of the year. So our problem is we're conflating too much, like separate it out. Just because a person is a great basketball player doesn't mean they're a great person. Just because somebody who has made a technological advance has changed the world doesn't mean they're a good person. I can't tell you how many people I have worked with who have said, they endured terrible narcissistic relationships. And when I asked them, like, what drew you to this person and sort of what keeps you in the game? Well, they're so smart. And I'm like, when did smart become a virtue? Smart is smart. You know, I mean, that's great. You're smart. Wonderful. That doesn't mean you're capable of deep emotion or empathy or intimacy. And that's our problem. We're putting very successful people up on pedestals and we're viewing them as holistically good people. No, they're good at one thing. We can acknowledge that, but we've got to stop viewing success as being necessarily good, because what that means is people then want to get close to successful people saying, well, this is going to be a great relationship. And more often than not, I say, no, it's not.
That's such a great piece of advice. I really also appreciated the advice I heard you share with somebody about parenting and how teaching empathy is sort of the anecdote to this and raising our kids with that trait. Can you give us, our audience, a couple tangible nuggets on what that actually looks like with young children? Because I've got mirroring as one of the things. Or maybe you can elaborate on that.
So the younger the child, we do it in different ways. There is no higher task than teaching a child empathy. There's really not. And alongside empathy is self-soothing. The child learning to regulate themselves, like recognizing you got to wait in line. You got to wait your turn. Sometimes you lose, and you're going to have to manage the emotion around that. So, and I think those two things are very related. But in an infant, empathy is achieved by staring at their face. And that's, if you look at the angle at which a child is fed or put on the breast, it's a perfect angle for them to make eye contact with the mother. So the mom may not want to be checking her phone while she's feeding her child, like face to face. That's how it's been done since time immemorial. Even physical touch, skin to skin, all of that slowly starts building up empathy. Doing mirrored games, you play with their expressions. They make an expression, you copy their expression. That's baby. But as they come up, as soon as they start having language, you start working with them on feeling. How do you feel? You teach them that feelings have names. You never shame their feelings. It can be built into play. You can read any children's book and a bear or a cat or a bird has a feeling. How do you think the bear felt? Like, how do you think the bear felt when Goldilocks was sleeping in his bed? You know what I mean? Like, I wasn't okay with that. Like, that kind of felt like breaking and entering, but they might say, I was happy Goldilocks was sleeping in my bed. You can take any children's story, and at the end of the book, that's actually where the magic happens. How do you think she felt? How do you think he felt? How do you think they felt? And you're now teaching your child to name emotions, not just in themselves, but in others. You can do this in TV shows. Like, I think that media can really be used as a jumping off place. You want to have your child spend time with other children so they can learn about taking turns. Like, oh, we baked a cupcake. How should we split this up? So they learn, like, oh, let's cut it in half. Oh, sure. Let's get a knife and cut it in half. So you're doing that. Now, as your child comes into, and I have to say, all of what I'm suggesting is easy to do through primary school. Like, gotta love the little ones. But once they hit middle school, their brains are developing in a different direction. They're more focused on their peers than their parents. They think adults are full of crap. And so empathy starts taking on a different tenor. What's interesting is puberty age, adolescent kids have a lot of empathy for their peers. They have none for their parents. And so the parents get confused and say, my kid has no empathy. And I'll say, can you tell me what your kid's like with their peers? And they're great with their peers. I'm like, good. The empathy is sound. They're trying to get rid of you. They're trying to make you so awful that when they have to leave, they're not panic stricken. It's actually a phenomenon called shitting the nest.
Ah.
And so they make a mess and then they're like, oh, this place sucks. I'm out of here. And that's how they let go. And I think for a lot of parents, we struggle. I have adolescent kids. We struggle with hurt feelings. And I have to remember that what they're doing is they're making it easier to leave. And my job as a parent is to make it easier for them to leave. So they're not looking backwards and saying, Mom, and I'm saying, I'm always here. It's just the difference is now you're carrying me inside your heart and I'm just not going to be at your side.
I'm going to cry.
That's coming
but that's
soon.
a hard thing for parents to do
is.
because when my child's moving out, I've got a child graduating high school soon. My child's moving out and I'm telling you, I see like a 6-month-old infant. And I'm thinking, well, no, she's not. And that's the piece I carry. And so, but all of that is part of the empathy that we have for our children. And we teach it over and over again. What we cannot do is tell our children, hey, you're more special than all the other kids. To hell with them. Go ahead and take 3 pieces of pizza. And sadly, some parents do that. Right. And so I know it seems so logical, but actually a lot of parents don't practice it. And narcissistic parents, least of all, because they have absolutely no blueprint or template for what empathy should look like in themselves or even in their children.
And now, a brief message from our Little Bit Culty sponsors.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
Growing your business can mean big-time logistical questions, like how are we going to keep up with all these local deliveries? Let Uber Direct offer you a helping hand. With Uber Direct, you take orders on your website, app, or by phone. Then drivers who are part of Uber's courier network pick them up from your store and deliver them to your customer's doorstep. Sounds simple, right? Uber Direct helps you give your customers what they want when they want it. Offer them delivery options in under 2 hours, on the same day, or scheduled up to 30 days in advance. Plus, share real-time tracking and ETAs by text. You can keep growing your business at a price that works for you. Never pay commission or hidden charges. Just pay a fixed fee per delivery. Delivery just got better with Uber Direct. Learn more at uberdirect.com.
Welcome back, everyone. That was Dr. Ramani putting narcissists on blast. I love that chat with her.
I was also on her podcast. I'll put that link in the show notes too. There was a 2-parter. That was one of the most meaningful and therapeutic interviews I ever did. Also, breaking news, we are going to have Dr. Ramani back on A Little Bit Culty to talk about her new book in 2024.
It's great that there are credible, credentialed professionals out there that are doing this work. We're always careful and clear about saying A Little Bit Culty is not your doctor. We're not therapists. We're not experts. But we for sure will always encourage you to talk to the real friggin' deal and process any of these things. But it's not always easy to find the right clinician in any situation, but maybe even more so if you've been through culty shit.
If you're someone who's gone through something culty, navigating the world of finding credentialed support can be re-traumatizing, for sure, because not every licensed professional knows what they're looking at with this stuff. Well, not yet, anyway.
This last segment is from our chat with Dr. Natalie Feinblatt. Dr. Feinblatt is a licensed clinical psychologist in a private practice in Los Angeles, California, who specializes in the treatment of addiction and trauma. And one of her trauma subspecialties is working with ex-cult members. In season 4 of A Little Bit Culty, she talked with us about what it takes to help ex-cult members make the transition to their former true pre-cult identities and what helps when it comes to standing strong in the face of exit fallout. It was a really practical, solution-oriented episode with Dr. Natalie Feinblatt. Listen to the entire thing if you want the full scoop, but here's a chunk that we found extra illuminating. Last but not least in our therapy session remix lineup, here's a little bit of our Little Bit Culty chat with Dr. Natalie Feinblatt.
So many people reach out to us, can you recommend therapists or psychologists who have a cult background? And that's something that we certainly at least recommend, at least, when people are reaching out, if you can find that, or someone who's at least trauma informed, but you have both. You're trauma informed and you have occult education.
Yes, I am. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm always happy to talk about it. So my father worked in the film industry for his entire career, and he does like picture cars. So he worked on the Tom Cruise movie Days of Thunder.
Cool Trickle.
Yeah.
Cool Trickle.
Yeah.
Familiar with his wins.
Yeah. And I was about 10 at the time, which when I went back and did the math on that, I was like, geez, Louise, I've been interested in this since I was 10. All the grownups were talking about how Tom Cruise was a Scientologist. And I was like, what's that? And no one could answer my question, which seemed really weird,
Yeah.
In spite of my last name, I was raised Catholic, and somebody asks you, what is the Catholic Church? You can kind of give them a rundown of it, or, what does being Jewish involve? People can give you a rundown of that, but nobody could tell me what Scientology was or what these people did. And it just stuck in my head. I was like, well, that's weird. Why do all of these people know about this, but nobody actually knows what it is, right? So fast forward maybe 7 or 8 years and the internet becomes a thing, right? And so curious me, one day, I was just like, oh, it wasn't Google back then. There wasn't a Google. Maybe it was Yahoo or Alta Vista or something. I don't
Jeeves.
Yeah, Ask Jeeves.
Ask Jeeves.
What is Scientology? And that got me into the burgeoning world online of former Scientologists who were connecting with each other and kind of starting to expose the truth about this organization. And it just fascinated me. So I just spent hours and hours reading everything I could online, looking at some books that were in existence at that point. And then that kind of led me to the broader just cult discussion and reading and listening and watching. And so from high school to dissertation, I was just somebody who was really, really interested in cults, and not just from like a true crime angle, but it also really interested me the ways in which cults impact people and how they try to heal after being in an organization like a cult. And so when it came time to write my dissertation, anybody who's done one probably goes through a similar process where you're supposed to pick a bunch of topics and then narrow it down. And that was one of my many topics, and it got narrowed down. And eventually that was the winner.
What was the title?
Oh my gosh, what was the title?
Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
It's been a while.
Yeah. Number one, it's been a while. And number two, I think anybody who's written a dissertation will tell you that no matter how much you love the topic, by the time you're done with your dissertation, you want nothing to do with it.
I hear you.
You're just done.
I feel that way about my essays in university, so I can't even imagine.
There you go. So it was something like the effectiveness of psychotherapy with former cult members, a literature review, something along those lines, which pretty much describes what it was. And so, yeah, that's where things got started for me, going from just like interested person to professional and academic work in this area.
Most people, when they hear about a cult, it's the salacious stuff that lures them in. It was more curious for you.
Oh, yeah.
Would you say that it allowed you more room for the human aspect of it as opposed to what most people are interested in when they watch it? They really just want to prove that it couldn't happen to them.
Right. Yeah. No, I do think that kind of opened me up to the human aspect of it. I just happened to hit, I think, the right place at the right time in terms of getting on that part of the internet at the time that all of these former Scientologists were kind of finding each other, creating community, in open forums for anyone to see, which is what I was looking at. And so that really gave me, it wasn't just the books or the documentaries or whatever. It was like real people telling their real stories about how they were going through what I know now is like PTSD and you know, the effects of coercive control, really being able to see on an individual level what this had done to people and how they were trying to heal from it.
You have a specialty in addiction and trauma.
Correct. Those are my two big areas. The longer I do this work, the more kind of parallels I see between like addiction recovery and cult recovery. They're not the same, obviously. But one of the things is that, you know, you can't really make somebody see the light before they're ready. You can't really make somebody want to change before they're ready, which can be really challenging for like loved ones and family members.
And they may never.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a real possibility.
Yeah, in both,
may never do
both addictions and cults. Some people don't get there. So that's one of the big similarities I've seen in that kind of work.
How do you think trauma and addiction are related?
Oh boy.
on a Venn diagram.
Well, no, I'm glad you said that, because that's the thing I always say to people is that I started in addiction treatment, and then it didn't take long for me to realize that you can't really specialize in addiction without specializing in trauma, because the Venn diagrams almost completely overlap. Before I was in private practice, I worked in addiction treatment for many years, like detox, residential, intensive outpatient programs, all this. And if I look back and think, how many of the people that I worked with during that time genuinely had no trauma history whatsoever? We're talking hundreds, maybe thousands of people. I can count them on my fingers. And so addiction, in my opinion, a lot of the time is a way to self-medicate and cope with post-traumatic stress. And it's just one way that people do that. And unfortunately, given the nature of substances in the human brain, that can then create an addiction on top of all the post-traumatic stress.
And probably more trauma.
Yeah, exactly. Because you get into all sorts of situations if your addiction's bad enough that create more trauma.
Where does getting involved in a cultic group fit into that Venn diagram?
That's a good question.
From your experience.
Yeah, I mean, I have definitely worked with some folks over the years in addiction treatment who got involved in groups. I mean, I talk about Scientology a lot, but Scientology has Narcanon, which is their rehab front group. And I worked with a few clients over the years who had well-meaning but uninformed loved ones send them to a Narcanon facility, and that never went well. Oh, and there's also the whole troubled teen industry thing where a lot of people get thrown into that again, and their family doesn't maybe do quite as much research to see that the place that they're sending them has maybe people online who are saying, don't send anybody here. It's abusive. It's culty.
Right. And just to remind our listeners about Elizabeth Gilpin, who wrote a book called Stolen, whose parents, again, well-meaning, trying to help her deal with basically just being a teenager, but didn't have the tools, and sent her to a group that used the methods of Synanon, which is now a well-known cult, and a lot of troubled teen industry use those same structures that are found in those substance abuse original recovery centers. Is that right?
Yeah. Synanon was definitely a thing here in LA. I think it was in the 70s, early 80s.
Yes.
That kind of got busted, but it fractured in a bunch of different directions, and a bunch of people who had kind of been bigwigs there went off to do their own thing, including founding these, therapeutic boarding schools, quote unquote, that just recycled a lot of this, really abusive Synanon treatment, again, quote unquote.
Right.
It's not treatment, it's abuse. But yeah, unfortunately, and some of those places are still out there and operating.
Have you heard of CRLA?
Oh, yes.
The one with Chris Batham?
Chris Batham, yeah. That was a whole big thing.
CRLA with Chris Batham. 80% natural ingredients, take one a day.
It indoctrinates you.
We have an interview lined up with one of the survivors of that group, which is, super cultic, but it also bridges this sort of therapy, recovery, culty behavior, narcissistic leader group, which seems to be consistent.
He's a great example of how there's a lot of corruption in addiction treatment, a lot of unethical stuff that goes on, like body brokering. And
what's body brokering?
Oh boy. So, yeah.
Asking a lot of boy questions today.
So body brokering is when treatment facilities will have a staff member whose job it is to essentially pay people to come to treatment in order to use their insurance benefits.
Right.
This will often involve paying for that person to relapse if they've been sober for a while, because insurance won't pay if you come in clean. This is a whole world, you guys. You can.
It's a major insurance
fraud. And it's also incredibly dangerous for people who are struggling with their recovery, because people who are, kind of semi in recovery get to know these body brokers, and they just hop from facility to facility getting paid to go from place to place, to stay there for 30 days, leave, relapse, go to another place. And obviously, when you're dealing with a life or death illness like addiction, this kills people, right? Like they don't always make it to the next place.
It has a built-in argument too, because if you call someone on that, you're being insensitive to their addiction. Wow.
It's protected. It's like instant gaslighting. Wow. I mean, I don't want to give anything away for the episode about CRLA, but I remember thinking, wait, Chris is taking this woman out for a drink? They're going out for a drink? I thought they were supposed to be in recovery. What the F? Okay. but we'll save that for another episode.
I noticed that once you bust one of these, there's a lot of spinoffs.
Oh, yeah. There's always lots of spinoffs. I mean, there's so many spinoffs of Scientology. There's one called Avatar. There's another one Landmark Forum has a little bit of Scientology in it. You know, people go to these groups, take certain things, and then kind of build their own little thing around it. Or the group ends and it splinters and it goes off in a bunch of different directions.
That's actually another episode I'm trying to work on is doing this whole like tree of like, when was the first large group awareness training, right? And what, like, I think it was around like LifeSpring, and then was it Werner Erhard spent time in Scientology and made LifeSpring, and then LifeSpring turned into Est, which turned into Landmark, and Keith went to took from Scientology. Like, it's just a freaking hodgepodge of the same shit.
Bunch
in
of
different formats.
Narcissists just stealing ideas and then going and making their own harmful thing.
Yeah, and then charging a lot of money for it.
Yeah, that too, of course. Let's not forget about that.
You like what you hear? Please do give us a rating, a review, and subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen. Every little bit helps us get this cult awareness content out there. Smash that subscribe button. You know what to do. Good stuff, Dr. Natalie Feinblatt. Well, we hope that you've gotten some good nuggets from this remix medley of some of A Little Bit Culty's greatest therapy hits. And we've gotten some feedback recently that I say nugget too much, and now I just can't stop saying it. Sorry. So sorry, my little nuggets.
It's a little provocative. We're always fans of counseling, therapy, and talking to someone with proper credentials about the gritty stuff of life. If you check out alittlebitculty.com/resources, we've put info in there that can be helpful if you or someone you know is going through culty shit. We've been there.
Oh, yes, we have been there. Thanks for listening, and see our show notes for links to all of the full episodes we made with these 3 fantastic guests. And come back soon for all new episodes of A Little Bit Culty, coming your way any second. Happy holidays, everyone. We love you.
Bye for now.
Bye for now.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean. I'm hanging on to the weight of my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We're heading over to patreon.com/alittlebitculty now to discuss this episode. In the meantime, dear listener, please remember, this podcast is solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. It's not intended as a substitute for real medical, legal, or therapeutic advice. For cult recovery resources and to learn more about seeking safely in this culty world, check out alittlebitculty.com/culty resources, and don't miss Sarah's TED Talk called How Cult Literate Are You? Great stuff.
A Little Bit Culty is a Trace 120 production, executive produced by Sarah Edmondson and Anthony Nippy Ames, in collaboration with producer Will Rutherford at Citizens of Sound and our co-creator and show chaplain/bodyguard, Jess Temple Tardy. Our show writer is Holly Zadra, and our theme song, Cultivated, is by John Bryant.